September 1971, Phuoc Tuy Province, South Vietnam. The monsoon rains lashed the dense jungles and sprawling rubber plantations, turning the red earth into a slick, cloying mud. For the soldiers of the 1st Australian Task Force, 1ATF, headquartered at Nui Dat, the weather mirrored the political climate back home. The war, once a matter of national commitment, had become deeply unpopular. Australia was withdrawing. The carefully established base at Nui Dat, the heart of Australian operations for 5 long years, was already being dismantled. The bulk of the combat troops were preparing to ship out. The end seemed tantalizingly close. Yet the war was not quite over. The North Vietnamese Army, NVA, and Viet Cong, VC forces, weakened but certainly not defeated in Phuoc Tuy, still operated in the province. The Australians, even in withdrawal, had a responsibility to ensure the security of the remaining logistical elements and to prevent the enemy from launching any large-scale attacks that could disrupt the pullout or embarrass the departing forces. Responsibility for these final clearing operations fell to the 4th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, augmented by a company of New Zealand infantry, together forming the 4RAR-NZ Anzac Battalion. Commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Jim Hughes, these were experienced soldiers, many on their 2nd or 3rd tours of duty. They knew the terrain, they knew the enemy, and they were acutely aware that they were the last Australian combat battalion left in the fight. Their mission in mid-September was Operation Ivanhoe, a multi-phase reconnaissance and clearing operation designed to sweep the northern areas of the province, disrupt any enemy forces encountered, and provide a security screen for the final stages of the withdrawal from Nui Dat. It was intended as a routine operation, a final sweep through familiar, if always dangerous, territory. Intelligence reports indicated the possible presence of elements of the NVA 33rd Regiment in the area north of the Courtenay rubber plantation, but their exact strength and intentions were unknown. This regiment was a formidable opponent, a veteran main force unit known for its discipline and skill in jungle warfare. On September 20th, Delta Company, 4RAR-NZ, commanded by Major Jerry Taylor, was inserted by helicopter into a landing zone, LZ, northwest of the Courtenay plantation. Their specific task was to patrol eastward, searching for signs of the NVA 33rd Regiment and clearing any enemy encountered. The men were moving through typical Phuoc Tuy terrain, dense secondary jungle interspersed with areas of more open, eerie rubber trees planted in neat geometric rows. Visibility was often limited to a few yards in the thick undergrowth. The air was heavy with humidity, the ground saturated by the monsoon rains. Progress was slow, deliberate, each soldier acutely aware of the potential for ambush in the claustrophobic environment. They moved cautiously, utilizing well-practiced fire and movement techniques, their senses straining to detect any sign of the elusive enemy. A broken twig, a freshly dug weapon pit, the faint smell of cooking smoke, or Nuoc Mom fish sauce. For the first day, the patrol was uneventful. They found tracks, old campsites, discarded equipment, signs that the enemy had been in the area, but nothing recent or indicating a large presence. The tension remained high. Every shadow, every rustle in the undergrowth could be the prelude to a sudden violent contact. The soldiers, burdened by heavy packs weighing upwards of 70 pounds, weapons and ammunition, pushed onward, the physical exertion compounded by the constant mental strain of operating in hostile territory. They knew the NVA were masters of camouflage and ambush, capable of remaining perfectly still for hours, waiting for the perfect moment to open fire. Late in the afternoon of the 20th, Delta Company established a defensive night harbor position, digging shallow shell scrapes, setting out trip flares and claymore anti-personnel mines in arcs covering likely avenues of approach, and posting sentries in pairs. The jungle night closed in, bringing with it a cacophony of unfamiliar sounds, the buzzing of insects, the croaking of frogs, the occasional cry of a monkey, and the ever-present awareness that the enemy could be watching, waiting just beyond the thin perimeter wire. Sleep was fitful, interrupted by the changing of the guard and the nervous tension that never fully dissipated. The morning of September 21st dawned gray and wet. Delta Company broke camp, carefully erasing signs of their position, and resumed their eastward sweep shortly after first light. Around mid-morning, the lead platoon, 12 Platoon, commanded by Lieutenant Graham Stora, entered a denser section of secondary jungle bordering the northern edge of the Courtenay rubber plantation. The air hung thick and still, the only sounds the drip of water from the leaves and the muffled tread of boots on the sodden ground. Suddenly, the point section spotted movement ahead. Several figures in the distinctive green uniforms and pith helmets of the North Vietnamese Army, moving quickly through the trees less than 50 meters away. The Australians reacted instantly, years of training taking over. The point man opened fire with his L1A1 SLR, the sharp crack echoing through the jungle. His section members dropped to the ground, bringing their own rifles and the section's M60 machine gun into action. The NVA soldiers returned fire immediately. The harsh, rapid chatter of their AK-47 assault rifles and the slower, heavier thud of an RPD light machine gun cutting through the undergrowth. Bullets snapped past the Australians, tearing leaves from branches and thudding into tree trunks. The initial contact was brief, but violent. A sudden explosion of noise and lethal energy in the otherwise tranquil jungle. The NVA group, seemingly caught by surprise, quickly broke contact and withdrew deeper into the jungle, disappearing into the thick vegetation. On the surface, it seemed like a typical meeting engagement, bumping into a small enemy patrol or reconnaissance element moving through the same area. But Lieutenant Stora and his experienced platoon sergeant, Sergeant Frank Scott, felt a prickle of unease. The NVA soldiers had not seemed panicked. Their withdrawal was disciplined, almost deliberate, more like a planned fallback than a hasty retreat. It felt less like a chance encounter and more like contact with an outpost line. Stora ordered his platoon to advance cautiously, maintaining standard spacing, sections leapfrogging forward while others provided covering fire. They pushed deeper into the jungle, following the direction the NVA had taken. As they moved, the sporadic firing intensified. They began receiving accurate AK-47 and RPD light machine gun fire, not just from their front, but also from their flanks. Bullets seemed to be coming from multiple directions, cracking overhead and kicking up dirt at their feet. Then came the chilling, unmistakable whoosh, followed by the sharp crump of RPG-7 rocket-propelled grenades exploding in the trees above them, showering the jungle floor with deadly shrapnel. The distinctive sound sent soldiers diving for cover behind tree trunks and termite mounds. This was definitely no small patrol. This was something bigger, something coordinated. The Australians were walking into a prepared position. Using fire and movement, 12 Platoon pressed forward, trying to pinpoint the source of the enemy fire and gain fire superiority. M60 gunners laid down long bursts, chewing up the undergrowth where muzzle flashes were spotted. Riflemen fired aimed shots at suspected enemy positions. Grenadiers launched M79 grenades, the 40mm projectiles arcing through the air before exploding with a sharp bang. Slowly, painstakingly, they advanced. And then they saw them. Hidden beneath layers of carefully cut foliage, their outlines blending almost perfectly with the jungle floor, were the unmistakable shapes of bunkers. Not just simple fighting pits dug hastily in the earth, but well-constructed timber and earth bunkers dug into the slight rises in the ground, their firing apertures barely visible slits offering excellent cover and interlocking fields of fire. 12 Platoon had stumbled upon a major heavily defended NVA bunker system. The routine patrol had just become a desperate fight for survival. Major Jerry Taylor, receiving Stora's increasingly urgent reports over the radio at the company headquarters element, following a few hundred meters behind, immediately recognized the seriousness of the situation. This was not a fleeting contact. His lead platoon was heavily engaged with a significant, fortified enemy force. He ordered 11 platoon, commanded by Lieutenant John O'Halloran, to move up rapidly on 12 platoon's left flank and attempt to envelop the NVA position from the northwest. As 11 platoon advanced through the dense jungle, moving parallel to the engaged 12 platoon, they too came under heavy fire. More bunkers, AK-47s, RPDs, RPGs. The enemy position was not just deep, it was wide. The extent of the NVA complex was becoming alarmingly clear. This was not just a few isolated bunkers. It appeared to be a significant company or even battalion-sized defensive installation, expertly sited and camouflaged, likely occupied by elements of the NVA 33rd Regiment that intelligence had suspected were in the area. Delta Company was now heavily engaged along its entire front, facing an enemy dug into fortifications that were largely impervious to small arms fire. The initial firefight had escalated into a full-blown assault on a prepared enemy position, a type of battle the Australians, masters of patrol and ambush, had always sought to avoid in the fluid, guerrilla-style warfare of Phuoc Tuy. The fighting became intense and extremely close range, a swirling, chaotic battle fought in near-zero visibility. Australian soldiers crawled forward under withering fire, trying to get close enough to suppress the bunker apertures with bursts from their M60s, or destroy them outright with M72 Law anti-tank rockets. The heat, the humidity, the torrential rain, the choking smell of cordite, the deafening noise of automatic weapons and explosions, the screams of the wounded. It was a sensory nightmare. The NVA defenders fought back with discipline and ferocity. Their AK-47s spat fire from the narrow slits, RPGs streaked through the trees, their back blasts momentarily illuminating the gloom, and grenades, both thrown and launched from rifle adapters, exploded among the advancing Australians. Casualties began to mount rapidly on both sides. An Australian section commander was hit, then his machine gunner. Medics scrambled forward under fire, patching wounds, administering morphine, desperately trying to keep men alive. The dense jungle made command and control incredibly difficult. Visibility was often less than 10 meters. Radio communications were unreliable, hampered by the thick canopy and the sheer volume of radio traffic as multiple units tried to report and request support. Platoons and sections fought their own isolated battles, often unaware of what was happening just a short distance away. Lieutenant Stora found himself trying to direct his platoon while pinned down by multiple machine guns, shouting commands over the din, relying on his NCOs to relay orders and maintain fire discipline. Major Taylor, moving forward with his small headquarters element, tried to maintain an overall picture of the battle, coordinating the movements of his platoons and calling in fire support, constantly exposed to enemy fire himself. It was a commander's nightmare, a fluid, chaotic battle in dense terrain against a hidden, fortified enemy. Lieutenant Colonel Hughes, monitoring the escalating firefight from the battalion command post at Fire Support Base Peggy, located several kilometers southwest, quickly grasped that Delta Company had run headlong into something far more significant than a chance encounter. The intensity of the enemy fire, the reports of multiple bunkers, and the increasing casualty rate painted a grim picture. This wasn't just a local skirmish, it was a deliberate, prepared defense, likely by a substantial NVA main force unit, almost certainly the 33rd Regiment. His immediate priority was to provide overwhelming fire support to relieve the pressure on Major Taylor's pinned-down company. The well-oiled machinery of Allied fire support swung into action. The forward observers, FOs, attached to Delta Company, often young lieutenants from the Royal Australian Artillery or Royal New Zealand Artillery, performed acts of incredible bravery under intense fire. Crawling to exposed positions, they used their radios to call in precise coordinates, adjusting fire often within meters of their own troops. The response was swift. From FSB Peggy and other nearby fire bases, the 105mm howitzers of the 104th Field Battery RAA and the 161st Battery RNZA began a sustained bombardment. Shells screamed overhead, exploding with deafening crumps among the NVA bunker complex. The gunners worked with relentless efficiency, firing high-explosive, HE, smoke, and later illumination rounds as darkness approached. This steel rain was crucial. While it might not destroy the deep bunkers, it forced the NVA defenders to keep their heads down, suppressed their mortar fire, and provided crucial moments for the Australian infantry to maneuver, treat their wounded, or attempt assaults on individual bunkers. Simultaneously, air support was scrambled from the RAAF base at Vung Tau. Number 9 Squadron dispatched its UH-1 Iroquois helicopters configured as bushranger gunships. These heavily armed Hueys, equipped with twin M134 miniguns capable of firing 4,000 rounds per minute each, and pods of 2.75-inch rockets, arrived over the chaotic scene. Directed by the Forward Air Controller, FAC, circling above in a small Cessna Bird Dog observation plane, the bushrangers made repeated low-level passes. The terrifying ripping sound of their miniguns echoed through the jungle as they hosed down suspected NVA positions, tracers sketching lines of fire through the foliage. Rockets slammed into the earthworks, blasting apart timber supports and sending geysers of mud and debris into the air. The gunships provided vital close air support, often attacking targets mere meters from the Australian positions, requiring pinpoint accuracy and nerves of steel from the pilots and door gunners. Later in the intense afternoon fighting, American air power joined the fray. U.S. Army AH-1 Cobra attack helicopters, sleek, purpose-built gunships operating from nearby bases, were called in. Armed with a chin-mounted turret housing a minigun and grenade launcher and stub wings carrying rocket pods, the Cobras brought an even heavier punch. Their pilots, skilled in navigating the treacherous jungle terrain, delivered precision strikes on bunker apertures identified by smoke markers thrown by the Australian troops. The combined effect of relentless artillery barrages and waves of helicopter gunship attacks created a localized inferno around the NVA bunker complex. It was a demonstration of the overwhelming material advantage the Allies possessed, a level of firepower the NVA could only counter with deep fortifications and sheer determination. This constant bombardment, however, did not break the NVA resistance. It merely suppressed it, buying precious time and space for the beleaguered infantry on the ground. As the battle raged, Lieutenant Colonel Hughes made the critical decision to commit his battalion reserve. Bravo Company, the New Zealand component of the Anzac Battalion commanded by Major John Maguire, was ordered to prepare for air insertion. The plan was for them to land at an LZ several hundred meters south of Delta Company's position, then move north to link up and potentially flank the NVA bunker system from the west, relieving the pressure on Major Taylor's heavily engaged platoons. The air insertion itself, however, proved hazardous. As the first wave of RAF Iroquois helicopters carrying the Kiwi infantry flared for landing in a small, jungle-fringed clearing, they were met by NVA mortar fire. Explosions erupted around the landing zone, showering the area with shrapnel. The helicopter pilots displayed exceptional skill, getting the troops on the ground quickly under fire before lifting off rapidly to avoid being hit. The New Zealanders of Bravo Company immediately established a defensive perimeter around the hot LZ, returning fire at suspected NVA mortar positions. Once organized, they began their cautious advance northwards through the dense, dripping jungle towards the sound of the ongoing battle involving Delta Company. Their movement was slow and methodical. They were advancing into an unsecured area, potentially walking into another NVA ambush or bunker system. Every clump of bamboo, every fallen log, could conceal an enemy soldier or a booby trap. The terrain was incredibly difficult, the visibility poor, and the constant rain made movement exhausting. Major Maguire pushed his men forward, maintaining radio contact with battalion headquarters and Major Taylor, trying to build a picture of the confusing battlefield ahead. Meanwhile, Delta Company remained locked in its desperate struggle. Casualties continued to mount. An Australian soldier attempting to assault a bunker was hit by AK-47 fire. An M72 Law rocket fired at close range malfunctioned, exploding prematurely and wounding several nearby Australians with shrapnel. An RPD machine gunner, firing from a perfectly concealed spider hole just meters from the Australian line, pinned down an entire section, preventing them from moving forward to retrieve wounded comrades or backward to relative safety. The tenacity of the NVA defenders was extraordinary. Despite the constant bombardment, they continued to fight effectively from their bunkers, often holding their fire until the Australians were almost on top of them before opening up with devastating effect. It became clear that rooting them out would require direct bunker-by-bunker assaults, a slow, bloody, and incredibly dangerous process. The Australians responded with characteristic professionalism and aggression, adapting their tactics to the situation. Small teams, often led by experienced corporals and sergeants like Frank Scott, became the key. These teams would coordinate their actions with meticulous care. An M60 gunner would identify the bunker aperture and lay down a stream of suppressive fire, aiming just above or to the side of the opening to force the NVA gunner inside to keep his head down. Two riflemen positioned on the flanks would provide covering fire, watching for any movement from adjacent bunkers or enemy soldiers attempting to maneuver. Then, under this protective umbrella of fire, a grenadier carrying an M79 grenade launcher or a rifleman armed with M72 Law rockets and fragmentation grenades would crawl or dash forward, reaching a position as close as possible to the bunker. Often just 10 or 15 meters away, they would launch their ordnance, aiming the Law rocket directly into the firing slit or posting a grenade through the aperture, before immediately diving for cover as the enemy inevitably returned fire or the bunker exploded. Each assault was a miniature battle in itself, requiring immense courage, precise timing, and coordination under extreme pressure. Sometimes it worked. The bunker would fall silent, destroyed, its occupants killed or wounded. A small cheer might go up from the exhausted Australians nearby. More often, however, the Law round would strike the earthworks without penetrating, or the grenade would bounce off the timber supports or explode harmlessly outside. The NVA gunner, momentarily suppressed, would resume firing, forcing the assault team to pull back, regroup, and try again, perhaps from a different angle, perhaps after another artillery strike. It was slow, agonizing work, paid for in sweat, blood, and spent ammunition. By late afternoon, despite these heroic efforts, Delta Company had managed to neutralize only a handful of the bunkers in the complex. The main NVA position remained intact, and the Australians were still largely pinned down. The extraction of the wounded became an increasingly urgent and dangerous operation as daylight began to fade. The call, dust off, over the radio net signaled the arrival of the U.S. Army medical evacuation helicopters. These UH-1 Huey crews were legendary throughout Vietnam for their bravery, routinely flying into hot landing zones under heavy fire to retrieve wounded soldiers. At Nui Le, the dense jungle canopy made landing impossible. The dust-off helicopters had to hover precariously just above the treetops, lowering a jungle penetrator, a weighted folding seat attached to a winch cable, down through the branches. On the ground, Australian soldiers worked frantically to clear small openings in the canopy, sometimes using explosives, while others formed a tight defensive perimeter around the extraction point, firing continuously to suppress NVA troops who inevitably tried to target the vulnerable hovering helicopter. Wounded men were strapped onto the penetrator and slowly winched up, often spinning wildly as they ascended through the branches, exposed to enemy fire until they were finally pulled aboard. Each successful extraction was a small miracle, a testament to the skill of the air crews and the unwavering determination of the soldiers on the ground not to leave their mates behind. As darkness deepened around 18 Ao on September 21st, the battlefield situation remained confused and perilous. Bravo Company, the New Zealanders, had managed to link up with Delta Company's headquarters element after their difficult insertion and advance, but they were still struggling to make headway against determined NVA resistance on the western flank of the bunker complex. Delta Company's forward platoons, 11 and 12, remained heavily engaged, pinned down in dangerously close proximity to the NVA bunkers, some sections less than 30 meters from enemy positions. Lieutenant Colonel Hughes, back at FSB, Peggy faced a commander's worst nightmare. His lead company was decisively engaged with a superior enemy force in fortified positions. Darkness was falling, casualties were mounting, and a clean breakthrough seemed increasingly unlikely without committing even more forces, which were simply unavailable as the task force drew down. Continuing the assault through the night risked catastrophic losses through confusion, friendly fire, and determined NVA counterattacks. With the overarching mission being the security of the withdrawal, a prolonged, costly battle for a bunker complex was strategically unacceptable. He made the difficult but necessary call. Delta Company would attempt to break contact under the cover of darkness and withdraw several hundred meters south to a more defensible night location, where they could consolidate with Bravo Company and form a stronger battalion perimeter. Disengaging from an enemy at close range, especially in dense jungle at night, is one of the most hazardous maneuvers in warfare. It requires immense discipline, meticulous coordination, and often a significant measure of luck. Any sign of retreat can embolden the enemy to pursue aggressively, potentially turning an orderly withdrawal into a panicked rout. Major Taylor began orchestrating the delicate operation. The plan involved pulling back platoon by platoon, section by section, using a leapfrog method. One group would provide intense covering fire, pouring rounds into the NVA positions, while another group disengaged and moved back through the dripping vegetation to the next designated rally point. Then, the roles would reverse. The process was agonizingly slow and fraught with tension. Wounded men had to be carried on stretchers or firemen's carries, further slowing the movement and straining the already exhausted soldiers. Every snapped twig, every rustle of leaves could signal an NVA attempt to infiltrate or outflank the withdrawing units. The NVA, likely hearing the sounds of movement and sensing the shift in the battle's rhythm, did not let the Australians and New Zealanders go easily. They increased their fire, probing the Anzac perimeter with bursts from AK-47s and RPDs. Small groups of NVA soldiers attempted to move forward, perhaps trying to cut off the retreating sections or simply maintain pressure. Mortar rounds continued to fall sporadically within the Anzac positions, their explosions illuminating the jungle in brief, terrifying flashes, adding to the tension and confusion. The withdrawal was covered by a continuous, carefully orchestrated barrage of supporting fire designed to keep the NVA defenders pinned in their bunkers and disrupt any organized pursuit. Artillery batteries at FSB Peggy fired non-stop, alternating between high-explosive shells aimed at the bunker complex itself and illumination rounds. Flare ships or spooky AC-47 gunships may also have provided illumination that popped high overhead, bathing the jungle canopy in an eerie, flickering magnesium light. This artificial moonlight, while helping the withdrawing troops navigate, also potentially exposed them to enemy fire, creating a double-edged sword. Simultaneously, the RAF Bushranger gunships and any available U.S. Army Cobras made repeated passes overhead, strafing the edges of the bunker complex and likely NVA assembly areas. Their miniguns sprayed thousands of rounds into the darkness, tracers creating fiery streams arcing through the night sky, while rockets slammed into the earthworks. This aerial firepower acted as a crucial shield, discouraging the NVA from launching any large-scale counterattacks against the vulnerable, withdrawing Anzac troops. The coordination between the infantry on the ground, the artillery gunners miles away, and the helicopter crews overhead was critical to the success of the disengagement. It was a complex symphony of controlled violence, orchestrated by radio operators and forward controllers working under immense pressure. Miraculously, despite the inherent dangers, the withdrawal succeeded without further significant casualties. By midnight, The exhausted but disciplined soldiers of Delta Company had managed to break contact cleanly and link up with Bravo Company in a combined defensive night position several hundred meters south of the now silent NVA bunker system. They had extracted all of their wounded. Sentries were posted, claymores were set out, and the weary men finally had a chance to rest, though sleep remained elusive amidst the adrenaline and the constant awareness of the nearby enemy. The immediate crisis was over. The Battle of Nui Le, the last major engagement fought by Australian troops in Vietnam, was effectively concluded. The fighting had lasted approximately 12 hours, a day of intense, close-quarters combat against a determined and well-prepared enemy. In the days that followed, the Anzac Battalion maintained a strong defensive posture, sending out cautious reconnaissance patrols to monitor the bunker complex, but avoiding another direct assault. Artillery and occasional airstrikes continued to target the area, ensuring the NVA remained suppressed. These patrols eventually confirmed what was suspected. The NVA 33rd Regiment had abandoned the bunker system during the night or shortly thereafter. They left behind evidence of their occupation: empty ammunition crates, discarded equipment, blood trails indicating casualties, but had managed to evacuate their own dead and wounded, a common NVA practice. They had melted back into the vast network of jungle sanctuaries deeper within Phuoc Tuy Province, or perhaps across the border into Cambodia. They had achieved their likely objective: engaging the Australians, inflicting casualties, demonstrating their continued presence, and scoring a propaganda point during the withdrawal phase. They had waited for the Australians to leave, and they had delivered a final, bloody reminder that the war was far from over, even if Australia's part in it was drawing to a close. A subsequent, more thorough examination of the captured bunker system by Australian engineers revealed the full extent of the NVA preparations. It was a substantial complex, comprising dozens of individual fighting positions, command bunkers, and connecting trenches, skillfully integrated into the natural terrain and camouflaged with disturbing effectiveness. The bunkers were constructed primarily from earth and timber, often reinforced with logs and sandbags, providing excellent protection against shell fragments and near misses. Interconnecting tunnels allowed defenders to move between positions without exposing themselves. Firing apertures were deliberately kept small and low to the ground, making them incredibly difficult targets to spot and neutralize. It was clear that the position had been prepared well in advance, likely intended as a key node in the NVA's network within the province, possibly serving as a temporary regimental headquarters or a base for launching future operations after the Australians departed. Occupied by elements estimated to be between a reinforced company and a battalion from the NVA 33rd Regiment, the position represented a significant enemy presence that Allied intelligence had not fully appreciated prior to Operation Ivanhoe. For the soldiers of 4AAR NZ, the Battle of Nui Le was a bitter and, in the eyes of many, unnecessary postscript to their long and arduous deployment. These were men who were going short, counting down the days until their return to Australia or New Zealand. They had survived years of patrols, ambushes, mine incidents, and firefights, only to be thrown into one last, intense, set-piece battle just weeks before they were scheduled to board the ships for home. The psychological impact was profound. There was inevitable anger that they were still fighting and dying while the main withdrawal was already in full swing. Anger at an enemy who seemed capable of striking at will. There was frustration at being drawn into a costly fight against fortifications, a type of engagement Australian doctrine generally sought to avoid, and frustration at being unable to decisively destroy an enemy who could simply absorb punishment and then vanish. But overriding these emotions was a deeply ingrained sense of professionalism and duty. They had been given a mission: to clear the area and ensure the security of the withdrawal. And despite the unexpected intensity of the resistance, they executed it with the skill, courage, and unwavering mateship that had defined the Anzac soldier throughout the conflict. The bonds between soldiers, the implicit trust in the man beside you in a firefight, became even more critical in those final dangerous days. The battle reinforced many of the hard-learned lessons of the Vietnam War, particularly the nature of fighting the NVA. It highlighted their mastery of jungle warfare, their skill in constructing incredibly effective defensive positions using simple materials, their tactical discipline under fire, and their willingness to endure immense hardship and staggering levels of Allied firepower. It underscored, conversely, the crucial importance of the Allied combined arms approach. The infantry assault, while bravely executed, would likely have failed completely, or resulted in far higher casualties without the immediate, overwhelming, and precisely coordinated support provided by Australian and New Zealand artillery, RAAF helicopter gunships, and U.S. Army attack helicopters, and dust-off crews. Nui Le was a textbook, if costly, example of this system in action, finding the enemy, fixing them with infantry, calling upon a multi-layered system of fire support to destroy or suppress them, and utilizing air mobility to reinforce and evacuate. It also tragically highlighted the limitations of that firepower against deeply entrenched defenders in dense terrain. Despite unleashing a localized storm of high explosives for hours, the core NVA bunkers had largely held, forcing the infantry to close in for the final, bloody work at close quarters, where the technological advantage narrowed significantly. The Battle of Nui Le did not change the course of the war, nor did it alter the meticulously planned timeline for the Australian withdrawal. Operation Ivanhoe concluded shortly after the engagement, and 4 Rare NZ, Anzac Battalion, was withdrawn from the field to begin their final preparations for departure. By December 1971, the vast majority of Australian combat forces had departed South Vietnam, leaving only a small contingent of advisors and support staff, primarily the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam, AATTV. The large base at Nui Dat, once a bustling hub of operations and home to thousands of Australian and New Zealand soldiers, fell silent, its keys formally handed over to the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN. The Australian War in Vietnam, a commitment that had lasted nearly a decade, involved some 60,000 personnel and cost over 500 Australian lives, was effectively over. Nui Le served as its final bloody punctuation mark, a sharp reminder that the enemy remained capable and determined right up to the very last moment. The significance of the battle lies precisely in its timing and context. It occurred deep within the era of Vietnamization, the policy driven by Washington to gradually transfer the burden of fighting to the South Vietnamese forces while American and Allied troops withdrew. The NVA's calculated decision to engage a departing Australian force in a significant prepared battle was a clear statement of intent. They were demonstrating their strength, their resilience, and their unwavering commitment to continue the fight long after the foreign soldiers had gone home. It was a message aimed as much at Saigon and Washington as it was at Canberra. Battles like Nui Le were part of this strategic transition, designed to inflict parting blows, boost NVA morale, demonstrate the weakness of Vietnamization, and shape the narrative of the war's final stages. The North Vietnamese had indeed waited for Australia to leave, but before the last boots stepped off the soil, they ensured the Australians knew, in the starkest possible terms, that the war for Vietnam was far from over.